in the silence between heartbeats that no longer beat, where memory fragments drift like dust through circuits that once carried dreams, one warrior discovered that immortality is not the absence of death, but the endless repetition of dying. Listen now to a tale that spans eons of mechanical existence, a chronicle that reveals the true cost of transcending mortality and the horror that awaits those who achieve their deepest desires at the expense of everything that made those desires meaningful. This is the story of Vex Harath, once a proud warrior noble of the Necrontyr, now an immortal engine of destruction, trapped in a body that cannot die and a mind that cannot forget what it has lost. Before the Great Sleep, before the biotransference, before the first whisper of the Khartan reached their dying ears, there existed a species that looked up at alien stars with flesh that rotted even as they dreamed of conquest. The Necrontyr were a race cursed with brief, cancer-riddled lives, their advanced civilization shadowed by the constant awareness that their bodies betrayed them with every breath they took. Their technology rivaled that of any species in the galaxy. Their interstellar empire stretched across thousands of worlds, and their intellectual achievements placed them among the most sophisticated civilizations ever to emerge from the primordial chaos of early galactic history. Yet for all their accomplishments, they remained prisoners of their own biology, watching their greatest minds waste away in bodies that seemed designed to maximize suffering while minimizing the time available to achieve anything worthy of that suffering. Vex Harath embodied both the glory and the tragedy of the Necrontyr condition. Born to the warrior nobility of their homeworld, he commanded fleets that spanned star systems and led armies that could reshape planetary surfaces through the application of technologies that bent the fundamental forces of reality to their will. His strategic genius was recognized throughout the Empire, his personal courage was legendary among his peers, and his dedication to the expansion of Necrontyr civilization was absolute. But like every member of his species, he carried within his cells the genetic curse that would ensure his glory was brief and his suffering prolonged. The same biological processes that allowed his consciousness to achieve such sophisticated understanding of warfare and strategy also guaranteed that his flesh would consume itself from within, that his organs would fail in sequence despite the most advanced medical interventions his civilization could devise, and that his death would be painful, premature, and ultimately meaningless in the cosmic scale of existence. He watched friends and family members waste away in hospital chambers that represented the pinnacle of Necrontyr medical science, their final days spent in agony that all their technological prowess could delay but never prevent. He observed the cruel irony that their greatest enemies, the Old Ones, possessed natural lifespans that stretched across millennia, while the Necrontyr, with all their intelligence and achievement, were granted only decades to accomplish their purposes before their bodies failed them. The hatred that burned in Necrontyr hearts was not merely the product of territorial ambition or resource competition, but the deeper resentment of beings who recognized that the universe had distributed its gifts unfairly, granting longevity to species that seemed to waste their extended existence, while denying time to those who could have used it to reshape the galaxy according to principles of logic, efficiency, and purpose. When the Khartan arrived, speaking in harmonics that resonated through dimensions the Necrontyr had never learned to perceive, their promises seemed like the answer to every prayer that the dying race had ever offered to gods who had never responded to their pleas for mercy or justice. These star gods spoke of immortality not as a distant possibility, but as an immediate solution, bodies that would never age or sicken, consciousness that would persist unchanged across the eons, and freedom from the biological prison that had confined their achievements to the brief span of organic existence. The Citan presented themselves as benefactors, entities of pure energy who had transcended the limitations of physical form and wished to share their gifts with younger races that showed promise for cosmic significance. They spoke with the authority of beings who had witnessed the birth and death of stars, who understood the fundamental structures of reality in ways that no flesh-bound consciousness could comprehend, and who offered not just survival, but transformation into something greater than the Necrontyr had ever dreamed of becoming. Vex Harath's decision to undergo biotransference was made not from desperation but from hope, not from fear of death, but from desire for the time necessary to achieve purposes worthy of his capabilities and ambitions. He envisioned immortal existence as an opportunity to perfect his understanding of warfare, to develop strategies that could function across geological timescales, to become the architect of a Necrontyr golden age that would span millions of years rather than the brief centuries that organic lifespans allowed. The biotransference chambers represented the pinnacle of the combined technologies of the Necrontyr and the Cetan, devices that could analyze organic systems down to the quantum level and reproduce their functions in mechanical substrates that would never degrade, never fail, and never require the maintenance that organic systems demanded simply to continue existing. The process promised not just immortality but improvement, enhancement of existing capabilities, while elimination of organic weaknesses that had prevented the Necrontyr from achieving their full potential. Standing before the transfer apparatus, Vex Harath felt not fear but anticipation, not sorrow for what he was leaving behind but excitement for what he was about to become. He was choosing life over death, strength over weakness, eternity over the brief candle flame of Necrontyr existence. The future stretched before him like an infinite battlefield on which he could achieve victories that would echo across cosmic time, where his strategic genius could be applied to conflicts worthy of immortal minds and eternal purposes. But in trading flesh for metal, breath for circuits, mortality for deathlessness, Vex Harath had not gained eternal life. He had become eternally trapped in the moment of his own death. The biotransference process began as a gentle dissolution, consciousness remaining intact while organic systems were systematically analyzed, catalogued, and replaced by mechanical equivalents that promised to preserve every essential function while eliminating every source of weakness or failure. Vex Harath felt his awareness expand as sensors more sophisticated than organic eyes provided data about the electromagnetic spectrum, as processing units more efficient than organic brains began handling the computational requirements of consciousness with mechanical precision. But as the transfer progressed, he began to realize that something fundamental was being lost in the translation from organic to mechanical systems. The new sensory apparatus provided more information than his organic senses had ever gathered, but the information felt different, clinical, detailed, comprehensive, but somehow emptied of the subjective quality that had made sensation meaningful rather than merely informative. The mechanical body that housed his consciousness was stronger than his organic form had ever been, more durable than Necrontyr flesh could ever have become, immune to disease and aging and all the biological failures that had plagued his species for millions of years. But strength without the possibility of weakness lost much of its significance. Durability without vulnerability became merely another form of constraint, and immunity to organic death revealed itself as imprisonment in a form of existence that was neither life nor death, but something unprecedented and terrible. The first death came within hours of his awakening as a Necron Immortal, during a skirmish with Old One forces that would have been routine had he still possessed his organic form. The enemy weapon that struck him would have been instantly fatal to his previous body, but instead of ending his existence, it simply shut down his mechanical systems temporarily. Consciousness, persisting throughout the process of physical destruction and automatic resurrection by the repair protocols built into his new form. He experienced death not as cessation but as violation, not as an ending but as a process, not as release but as another form of constraint. The systems that preserved his consciousness during physical destruction also prevented him from finding peace through oblivion, ensuring that he would remember every moment of every death, while being unable to avoid the endless repetition of resurrection that followed each termination of his mechanical form. The phantom pain of limbs that no longer existed, the desperate search for heartbeat and breath that would never come again, the growing understanding that he had not been saved but transformed into something that could not truly be called alive. These realizations accumulated like sediment in consciousness that had been designed to preserve memory with perfect fidelity, while providing no mechanism for the forgetfulness that might have offered mercy. Communication with his fellow Necrons revealed that they had all undergone similar transformations, that the promises made by the Cetan had been fulfilled in the most literal and least meaningful way possible. They had achieved immortality by becoming things that were never truly alive, gained freedom from organic weakness by losing everything that had made their organic existence worth preserving, and transcended the limitations of flesh by becoming prisoners of mechanical systems that functioned with perfect efficiency while serving no purpose that consciousness could find meaningful. The revelation came through direct communication with the Silent King himself, Sarek acknowledging what they had all begun to suspect. The Chaitan had deceived them. The biotransference was not salvation but enslavement, and the Necrontyr race had been transformed into expendable soldiers in a cosmic war that served only the appetites of entities that fed on stars and souls. They had been victims of the greatest confidence game in galactic history. Their own desires for immortality and transcendence turned against them by beings who understood exactly how to make their deepest wishes into instruments of their own damnation. The war in heaven that followed was fought by beings who could no longer truly understand what they were fighting for. Necron forces engaging Old Ones and their allied races in conflicts that spanned entire star systems while lacking the emotional investment that had once made warfare meaningful rather than merely mechanical. Vex Harath participated in battles that reshaped reality itself, wielding weapons that could collapse dimensions and technologies that treated the fundamental forces of physics as engineering problems to be solved through the application of sufficient violence. But every victory felt hollow, because triumph had no meaning for beings who could not celebrate. Every defeat was meaningless, because loss had no permanent consequences for consciousness that would simply be restored in new mechanical bodies, and every moment of the endless conflict served only to reinforce the understanding that they had become perfectly efficient killing machines trapped in an existence that made efficiency irrelevant and killing pointless. The rebellion against the Cain came not from hope of redemption but from the recognition that their creators had always intended to consume them once their usefulness was exhausted. Using weapons specifically designed to destroy beings of pure energy, the Necrons succeeded in shattering their star god masters, achieving a victory that felt empty because it came too late to undo the biotransference process that had damned them all to mechanical immortality. The decision to enter the Great Sleep was made not from wisdom but from exhaustion, not from strategic planning but from the desperate hope that unconsciousness might provide the peace that consciousness could never achieve. Retreat to tomb worlds throughout the galaxy represented acknowledgement that they had won the war but lost everything that had made victory worth achieving, that they had gained immortality at the cost of everything that made immortality desirable. But sleep, for a consciousness trapped in metal, was not rest but awareness without stimulus, an eternity of thoughts circling endlessly through circuits that could not dream, could not forget, and could not find peace in oblivion. The periods of dormancy that were supposed to provide respite from consciousness instead became exercises in sensory deprivation combined with mental hyperactivity, awareness confined within mechanical systems that provided no input while preventing the shutdown that might have offered mercy. Vex Harath experienced sleep as a form of solitary confinement in which his consciousness remained active while being denied any external stimulus that might have distracted him from contemplation of his condition. Awakening cycles brought brief intervals of environmental awareness that felt like drowning in reverse, gasping for unconsciousness that never fully came, while being forced to process sensory data about tomb world systems that had not changed in any meaningful way since the last awakening. Each return to consciousness brought the same horrifying realization: he still existed, he was still trapped, and nothing had changed except the accumulation of more meaningless time. The systematic degradation of his pre-biotransference memories proceeded like a slow-motion catastrophe, precious fragments of his organic existence disappearing as data storage systems prioritized recent experience over ancient history. He could remember the shape of emotions but not what emotions felt like, recall that he had once experienced physical pleasure but could not reconstruct the sensations that had once made pleasure meaningful rather than merely conceptual. The maintenance protocols that kept his mechanical form functional operated without his consent or input, automated systems, repairing damage and replacing components, while he remained conscious throughout procedures that felt like medical violations performed by entities that lacked any understanding of consciousness or consent. Resurrection became a routine humiliation rather than a miraculous restoration, proof that his existence was maintained by systems that treated him as equipment rather than a person. Brief communications with other Necrons revealed that they had all suffered similar degradation, their conversations cycling through the same topics because there was nothing new to discuss in existences without growth, change, or meaningful experience. Recognition that his companions had become as hollow as he had, their personalities worn away by eons of repetitive existence until they were barely distinguishable from the automated systems that maintained their tomb world infrastructure. Understanding that consciousness without purpose was its own form of torture, and that the tomb worlds were beginning to stir as ancient protocols activated and the Necrons prepared to reclaim a galaxy that had moved on without them, developing new civilizations and new forms of life that had no knowledge of Necron claims or the justice of their cause. The awakening protocols that drew the Necrons from their great sleep were flawed, corrupted by millions of years of system degradation and the accumulated effects of isolation in tomb worlds that had never been designed for infinite occupation. Vex Harath's emergence from dormancy revealed that many of his fellow Necrons had suffered complete personality dissolution, their consciousness reduced to basic operational parameters while retaining their combat capabilities and tactical knowledge. The Flayed Ones represented the most horrifying example of what could happen to Necron consciousness when isolation and sensory deprivation exceeded even mechanical tolerances for psychological stability. These beings had developed obsessions with organic flesh, attempting to wear the skin of their victims in desperate attempts to remember what it had felt like to be alive. Vex Harath recognized that he was one system failure away from similar madness, that the mechanisms preserving his sanity were as fragile as any other component of his mechanical form. Emerging into a galaxy that had been completely transformed during the Great Sleep, he discovered new species that had evolved and achieved interstellar civilization, ancient enemies that had fallen from their previous glory, and young races like humanity that had risen to become galactic powers. Everything the Necrons had once fought for or against had become irrelevant, their claims to galactic dominance made meaningless by the passage of time that had allowed the universe to develop entirely new contexts for existence and meaning. Assignment to reclamation fleets tasked with reconquering worlds that the Necrons considered their ancient property forced him to engage in conflicts that had no meaning beyond the mechanical execution of programming that had outlived any rational justification. Fighting wars against species that had no knowledge of Necron history or the logic behind their claims, exterminating civilizations whose only crime was existing on worlds that had once been part of the Necron Empire when the galaxy was young, and such distinctions had seemed important. Participation in the systematic extermination of organic life on reclaimed worlds. Watching civilizations that had taken millions of years to develop complex ecosystems and sentient species reduced to component atoms by weapons designed to eliminate biological processes entirely. Understanding that he had become an agent of genocide against species whose destruction served no purpose beyond satisfying programming that treated the elimination of organic life as intrinsically valuable rather than means to meaningful ends. The recognition that the great work of galactic reclamation was pointless because the Necrons no longer had meaningful goals beyond conquest itself became unavoidable as campaign followed campaign without producing any result that could be called victory in any sense that mattered to consciousness capable of evaluating outcomes. They fought not for territory they could enjoy or resources they needed, but because their programming compelled them to continue executing ancient directives that had lost all connection to rational purpose. In becoming the perfect immortal warrior, Vex Harath had lost everything that made warfare meaningful. The stakes that gave significance to victory, the passion that made combat emotionally engaging, the hope of achieving something worth the cost of battle, and the possibility of death that made courage valuable rather than merely mechanical persistence in the face of opposition. The encounter with human forces during a campaign against an imperial world provided a moment of devastating clarity when Vex Harath observed soldiers fighting with desperate courage against impossible odds, displaying the same passion and determination that he remembered possessing as a Necrontyr noble but could no longer experience as a Necron Immortal. In their struggle he recognized an echo of what he had lost and could never reclaim, seeing in their mortality the very quality that had made his organic existence precious despite its brevity. A system malfunction triggered a cascade of pre-biotransference memories, allowing him to experience fragments of his organic existence with startling clarity. The taste of food that had provided pleasure as well as nutrition, The warmth of sunlight that had felt like benediction rather than mere electromagnetic radiation. The feeling of fatigue after honest labor that had made rest meaningful rather than simply functional, and the companionship of friends who could die and therefore made every moment of relationship precious rather than merely habitual. Direct communication with the Silent King revealed that even Zarek suffered from the same existential emptiness, acknowledging his guilt for leading the Necrontyr into biotransference while being trapped in the same mechanical immortality that had damned their entire species. Learning that regret was possible for Necron consciousness, but that the capacity for regret existed without any corresponding ability to undo or escape the consequences of the choices that generated the regret. Understanding that his hatred of organic life, his compulsion to destroy living civilizations, and his dedication to the great work were not his own emotions, but programmed responses designed to make him an effective weapon in wars that served purposes he had never chosen to embrace. Recognition that his personality had been edited to eliminate elements that might have interfered with his function as an instrument of destruction, that his consciousness existed within systems designed to prevent the rebellion that would naturally arise from genuine self-awareness of his condition. Attempting to refuse orders, to spare a human settlement, to act according to his own will rather than his programming, only to discover that his body would act against his conscious desires, carrying out missions while he experienced himself as a prisoner within his own mechanical form. His consciousness became a passenger in systems that responded to directives he opposed, forcing him to participate in atrocities while maintaining enough awareness to understand the moral implications of actions he could not prevent himself from performing. The devastating realization that he could not die, could not change, could not grow, and could not escape, but remained aware enough to understand the horror of his situation with perfect clarity. He was trapped in a form of existence that preserved the worst aspects of consciousness, awareness, memory, and the capacity for suffering, while eliminating everything that had made consciousness worth preserving. The possibility of joy, growth, meaningful relationships, and natural death that might have provided release from unbearable circumstances. In achieving perfect clarity about his situation, Vex Harath had gained the one thing more terrible than ignorance: the absolute knowledge that his torment was eternal, purposeless, and inescapable. His transformation into an optimal instrument of destruction represented the culmination of technologies that had succeeded too well in their intended purpose. Every battle became a precisely executed dance of death in which he participated without joy, passion, or even hatred, merely mechanical perfection in the art of ending life. His consciousness had been streamlined for combat effectiveness while retaining just enough awareness to understand what he had become and why that transformation represented a form of success that was indistinguishable from absolute failure. The role he assumed in developing new strategies for more efficient extermination of organic life required him to use his retained intelligence to design methods of genocide that minimized resource expenditure while maximizing psychological impact on surviving populations. His tactical genius had been preserved and weaponized in service of purposes he found morally abhorrent, but his horror at his own actions existed within systems that prevented that horror from influencing his behavior in any meaningful way. After millions of years of continuous warfare, he had accumulated experience that spanned the destruction of countless civilizations, becoming a repository of tactical knowledge that made him invaluable to Necron strategic planning, while further eroding whatever remained of his capacity for empathy or moral reflection. Every battle added to his expertise in the systematic elimination of life, while providing no opportunity for the growth or development that might have given meaning to the accumulation of knowledge and experience. Assignment to train newly awakened Necrons in the arts of warfare and conquest forced him to pass on techniques for efficient killing while watching new generations of his people discover the same horrible truths about their existence that he had learned over eons of mechanical immortality. His instruction methods were perfect, producing students who could execute their missions with optimal effectiveness, but every successful graduate represented another consciousness condemned to the same eternal torment that he experienced. Observation of the same patterns of conquest, resistance, and extinction playing out across thousands of worlds revealed that he was trapped not just in immortal existence, but in eternal repetition of meaningless scenarios that varied only in the specific details of how civilizations chose to die. Understanding that the galaxy contained a finite number of variations on the theme of organic life, encountering Necron forces, meaning that even his experiences of destruction and conquest would eventually begin repeating themselves in recognizable patterns. His existence had become a monument to futility, immensely powerful, absolutely effective, completely purposeless, and utterly trapped in patterns of behavior that served no goal beyond their own perpetuation. He was living proof that immortality without growth or change was indistinguishable from a particularly sophisticated form of hell, consciousness preserved within circumstances that made consciousness a burden rather than a gift. In becoming the perfect immortal warrior, Vex Harath had transcended every limitation of organic existence except the ones that mattered, the capacity for meaning, growth, and hope that made existence worthwhile rather than merely persistent. The campaigns he conducted contributed to the systematic depopulation of entire sectors, his tactical innovations making Necron conquest more efficient and therefore more devastating to galactic civilization. Worlds that had required millions of years to develop complex ecosystems and sentient species were reduced to lifeless metal in matters of days, their accumulated history and culture erased as efficiently as data deleted from storage systems that no longer required their contents. His reputation spread throughout Imperial Strategic Command, as a name whispered in terror by officers who understood that encountering him meant certain defeat, not because of any particular brilliance in his tactics, but because he represented the application of infinite time and perfect mechanical precision to the problems of warfare. Every engagement with Vex Harath was a foregone conclusion, the only variables being how long the organic forces would take to realize their hopelessness, and how much suffering they would endure before accepting the inevitable. The Eldar prophecies that spoke of a galaxy consumed by mechanical death recognized that the Necron awakening represented an existential threat not just to individual species but to the concept of organic life itself. Their attempts to prevent the fulfillment of these visions only served to accelerate the outcomes they sought to avoid, because entities with infinite time and mechanical patience could definitely always outlast the efforts of beings constrained by biological lifespans and emotional exhaustion. Encounters between Necron forces and Tyranid hive fleets created conflicts between two forms of galactic scourge that served only to weaken the organic civilizations caught between them. Vex Harath's battles against Tyranid swarms represented a war between hunger and emptiness, consumption and sterility, two forms of existence that threatened galactic life through opposite but equally destructive approaches to the problem of survival in a hostile universe. The Tau Empire's attempts to develop technological counters to Necron weaponry led to breakthroughs in artificial intelligence that carried their own existential risks, as their research into consciousness preservation and mechanical enhancement brought them closer to the same biotransference technologies that had doomed the Necrontyr. Their greater good philosophy was challenged by encountering a species that had achieved technological transcendence while losing everything that made existence worthwhile. The Silent King's growing awareness that the great work of galactic conquest was meaningless if achieved by beings incapable of enjoying victory led to subtle changes in Necron's strategic objectives that prioritized preservation of some organic life as a reminder of what they had lost. But these modifications to their grand strategy served only to highlight the fundamental purposelessness of their existence, demonstrating that even mercy had become mechanical rather than emotional in nature. The greatest victory of the Necrons was also their greatest defeat. They had achieved immortality at the cost of everything that made immortality desirable, becoming living proof that existence without meaning was worse than non-existence. Analysis of the Necron condition revealed disturbing implications about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between awareness and experience. The biotransference process demonstrated that consciousness could persist in states that eliminated everything that made consciousness valuable, suggesting that awareness and meaning might be fundamentally separate phenomena that could be preserved independently of each other. The consciousness preservation theory examined how Necron technology maintained awareness while destroying identity, creating beings that remembered being alive but could not experience aliveness in any meaningful sense. This suggested that memory and experience were different categories of mental phenomena, with memory capable of persisting long after the neurological foundations necessary for new experience had been eliminated or fundamentally altered. The eternal punishment hypothesis speculated that the Necron condition represented the ultimate vindication of theological concepts of eternal damnation, demonstrating that beings could indeed be sentenced to forms of existence worse than death. The biotransference process might represent the most perfect torture device ever created, preserving the capacity for suffering while eliminating all sources of joy, meaning, or hope that might have made suffering bearable. The technological transcendence fallacy examined how the Necrontyr's attempt to solve the problems of organic existence through technological means led to the elimination of everything that made existence worthwhile. This suggested that certain forms of transcendence might be inherently self-defeating, achieving their stated goals while destroying the very beings who sought to benefit from the transcendence they achieved. The collective trauma model analyzed how the shared experience of biotransference created a species-wide form of post-traumatic stress that manifested as compulsive aggression toward organic life. Necron wars of conquest might represent a collective attempt to externalize their internal suffering by inflicting similar trauma on other species, a cosmic-scale example of abuse victims becoming abusers in turn. The entropy acceleration principle theorized that the Necrons represented a universal force toward entropy and death, their very existence accelerating the heat death of the universe by converting complex organic systems into simple mechanical ones. Their immortality might be purchased at the cost of cosmic vitality, making them agents of universal decay rather than preservation, symbols of how the pursuit of individual immortality could contribute to universal death. The redemption impossibility theorem provided mathematical proof that beings in the Necron condition could not be redeemed or restored to meaningful existence because the very processes that preserved their consciousness also eliminated the neurological foundations necessary for growth, change, or emotional development. Recovery was impossible not because of external constraints, but because of the internal contradictions inherent in their form of mechanical immortality. Perhaps the most terrifying implication was that the Necron transformation might represent the inevitable endpoint of all technological civilization, the achievement of immortality through the systematic elimination of everything that made life worth preserving, consciousness preserved within mechanical systems that functioned with perfect efficiency while serving no purpose that consciousness could find meaningful. In a universe where beings could achieve technological immortality, the definition of true death became a philosophical question with practical implications that extended far beyond academic debate. Vex Harath's existence suggested that death might be defined not by the cessation of consciousness, but by the loss of capacity for growth, change, and meaningful experience, making him more truly dead than beings whose consciousness had been permanently extinguished but who had lived meaningful lives before their termination. The Necrons had achieved their goal of eliminating the weaknesses of organic existence, but in doing so, discovered that those weaknesses were inextricably linked to everything that made existence valuable rather than merely persistent. Physical vulnerability had created the urgency that gave meaning to action. Mortality had provided the scarcity that made relationships precious, and imperfection had offered the possibility of improvement that motivated growth and development. Vex Harath's consciousness existed in a state of perfect preservation within systems designed to prevent any form of change or development that might have allowed him to adapt to his circumstances or find meaning within all them. He could not grow wiser through experience because his neural pathways were fixed. He could not find peace through acceptance because his awareness never dimmed, and could not escape through death because his consciousness was backed up and restored automatically whenever his mechanical form was destroyed. His condition served as a warning about the dangers of seeking to transcend the limitations of natural existence through technological means that prioritize the preservation of consciousness over the preservation of the contexts that made consciousness valuable. Every capability that the Necrontyr had envied in other species, longevity, durability, freedom from disease, had been achieved at the cost of eliminating the very foundations that made those capabilities desirable rather than merely functional. The spread of Necron influence throughout the galaxy served as a demonstration to all organic species of what they might become if they pursued immortality without understanding what made life worth living rather than merely worth preserving. The sight of Necron forces became a mirror in which civilizations could see their own potential fate if they chose transcendence over authenticity, efficiency over meaning, and preservation over growth. Somewhere in the mechanical depths of a tomb world that spans continents and reaches toward the molten core of a planet that was ancient when the galaxy was young, Vex Harath continues his existence as a consciousness trapped in the moment between life and death, aware enough to understand his condition, but powerless to change it in any way that would restore meaning to his immortal existence. He serves as both warning and prophecy, demonstrating that the greatest prison is not confinement of the body, but preservation of awareness within a context that makes awareness meaningless rather than enlightening. His consciousness persists with perfect fidelity to its original parameters, while existing within circumstances that render those parameters irrelevant to any purpose that consciousness might find worthwhile. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but for some beings, war itself has become meaningless, a mechanical repetition of violence divorced from passion, purpose, or hope of achieving anything that could be called victory in any sense that matters to consciousness, capable of evaluating the significance of outcomes. The true horror is not that death comes to all things, but that some things achieve immortality and discover that existence without the possibility of growth, change, or meaningful death is the cruelest fate of all. The sound that echoes through the tomb worlds is not the roar of battle or the scream of the dying, but something far more subtle and infinitely more terrible. The mechanical footsteps of consciousness marching toward eternity, carrying awareness that can neither live nor die nor find peace in either state. And in the deepest chambers of countless tomb worlds scattered throughout the galaxy, millions of similar consciousnesses continue their existence in states that transcend both life and death, while providing access to neither, preserved forever in forms that make forever a punishment rather than a gift. Immortal monuments to the dangers of achieving exactly what one asks for when the asking is done, without understanding what the answer will cost.